What would you do if you checked into a hotel and couldn't find your way out? Room after room, hallway after hallway, it never ends. And the worst part, you're not alone. It started like any other long drive. Emma was used to the monotony of road trips, the endless gray asphalt stretching into the horizon. She had done it 100 times before, driving through small towns and past forgotten landmarks on her way to a friend's wedding. But this trip felt different. The road was too quiet, too still, and the dark seemed heavier than usual. Her gas gauge dipped dangerously close to empty. She hadn't seen a gas station in miles, and her phone had lost signal hours ago. She was starting to panic when a glowing sign emerged from the blackness ahead. The Eternal Lodge, it read, the letters flickering in and out like a weak heartbeat. She sighed in relief. At least she could rest for the night and figure out the rest tomorrow. The gravel crunched under her tires as she pulled into the parking lot, which was oddly empty despite the hotel being enormous. The building was old but well-maintained, its Gothic spires and intricate stonework illuminated by dim floodlights. Something about the place felt off. She hesitated, her fingers drumming against the steering wheel, but exhaustion won out. Inside, the lobby was quiet and cold, like stepping into a mausoleum. A large chandelier hung above, its crystals catching the flicker of candles that lined the walls. The air smelled faintly of lavender and mildew. A man stood behind the reception desk, his skin pale and his eyes unervingly wide. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome to the Eternal Lodge," he said in a voice that was too smooth, like silk over a blade. "Room 303 is ready for you." She blinked. She hadn't even told him her name, let alone requested a room. "Do you need my credit card or ID?" she asked, but the man simply handed her a brass key. "Everything is taken care of," he said, his grin widening. "Enjoy your stay." Something about his tone made her stomach turn, but she was too tired to argue. She took the key and headed up the grand staircase, the sound of her boots echoing in the vast, empty space. Room 303 was at the end of a long hallway lined with faded wallpaper and crooked paintings. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was basic but clean, queen bed, small desk, and a single window with curtains drawn tightly shut. The air was stale, but she didn't care. She locked the door, threw her bag on the chair, and collapsed onto the bed. She didn't remember falling asleep, but she woke up to a soft knock at the door. It was 3:03 a.m. "Hello," she called out, her voice groggy and thick with sleep. There was no answer. She sat up, her heart pounding. Another knock, louder this time. She crept to the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. She stood there for a moment, waiting, but nothing happened. With a shaky breath, she crawled back into bed, pulling the blankets tightly around her. The next morning, she woke up with a sense of unease. The light streaming through the curtains was gray and dim, as if the sun itself were struggling to shine. She decided to head downstairs to check out and get back on the road, but when she opened the door, the hallway was different. It wasn't the same hallway she had walked down the night before. The wallpaper was a different pattern, the carpet a different color. The air felt colder, heavier, and there were no windows. She tried retracing her steps to the staircase, but it wasn't there. Instead, the hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with doors that all looked the same. Panic bubbled up in her chest as she began to run, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. She opened door after door, only to find identical rooms, empty, sterile, and eerily quiet. It felt like the building was playing a cruel joke on her, shifting and rearranging itself to trap her. Hours passed, or maybe days. She wasn't sure anymore. The windows all showed darkness outside, and her phone was completely dead. The screen frozen at 3:03 a.m. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but no matter how far she walked, she never found a lobby or a kitchen. The only sound was the faint hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. And then the whispers started. At first, they were so quiet she thought she was imagining them. But as time went on, they grew louder, clearer. "Emma, why did you come here?" Stay forever. Her name echoed through the halls, spoken by voices that weren't hers. Shadows moved in the corners of her vision, darting closer whenever she turned her back. The walls seemed to pulse, almost as if the hotel were alive, breathing, watching her. She tried breaking a window, but the glass wouldn't budge. She tried kicking down doors, but they all led back to the same hallway. Her mind began to fray. She started talking to herself, muttering prayers and curses as she wandered, and then she found a door that was slightly ajar. Inside was a small room with a single chair and an old television, its screen flickering with static. As she stepped closer, the static shifted, forming an image. Her image. It was her, walking through the same hallway she had just come from, her face pale and sunken, her eyes wide with terror. "You've been here before," a voice whispered from the television, "and you'll be here again." She stumbled backward, her heart pounding. When she turned to run, she nearly collided with the receptionist. His face was no longer human. His features were stretched and blurred, his grin impossibly wide. "Your room is ready," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. She screamed and ran, but no matter where she went, she always ended up back at room 303. She stopped trying to escape after what felt like weeks, though time had lost all meaning. She sat in the room, staring at the walls, listening to the whispers that never stopped. One day, there was a knock at her door. When she opened it, a young man stood there, holding a suitcase. "I think I have the wrong room," he said, his voice uncertain. Emma smiled, her lips cracking. "No, you're exactly where you're supposed to be." The door closed behind him, and the cycle began again. Emma watched the young man from the crack in the door as he slowly made his way down the hall. Confusion etched on his face. She had seen this before. The hesitation, the glances over his shoulder, the growing sense of dread. It was always the same. She wanted to warn him, but the whispers wouldn't let her. They were louder now, filling her head like a swarm of bees. "Stay quiet, Emma. He's ours now. Watch, like you always do." Her body moved on its own, stepping back from the door and closing it softly. She slumped against the wall, her hands trembling. Every new guest that arrived chipped away at her remaining sanity. She wasn't sure how long she had been there. Days? Months? Years? Time in the hotel didn't flow like it should. Her memories of her life before arriving had started to fade. She couldn't recall where she had been driving to or even what the world outside the hotel looked like. But the hotel wouldn't let her forget certain things. It wouldn't let her forget the smell of lavender and mildew, the receptionist's hollow grin, or the feeling of the hallway shifting beneath her feet. And it wouldn't let her forget the whispers. She clutched her head, trying to drown out the voices, but they only grew louder. She thought about the young man again, wondering how long it would take before he too became part of the hotel. They always did. Some fought it longer than others, but the hotel never lost. Emma had tried to fight once too. She remembered the first time she had encountered one of the other residents. It was a woman, her face gaunt and her eyes sunken like Emma's were now. The woman had tried to warn her, to tell her the truth about the hotel, but the whispers stopped her. They drowned her words in a cacophony of sound, and Emma hadn't understood what she was trying to say. When she saw the woman again, she wasn't the same. Her face had twisted into something unrecognizable, and her eyes gleamed with a strange light. She had become part of the hotel, just like Emma was becoming. Emma stood up, pacing the small room. She could feel the walls closing in, pressing against her. The hotel wasn't just a building, it was alive and it fed on them. Every scream, every tear, every ounce of fear, it consumed them all. She tried to focus, to remember the young man's face. Maybe he would be different. Maybe he could escape. The whispers laughed at her. "No one leaves, Emma. Not you, not him. Don't you remember?" She froze. Her eyes darted to the mirror above the dresser. She hadn't looked at herself in a long time. The reflection that stared back at her was hollow and lifeless, her skin pale and stretched, her eyes dark and empty. But there was something else. Behind her, the door to room 303 was open again. Emma turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The door hadn't opened on its own in years. She stepped toward it cautiously, peering into the hallway. It was empty, but the whispers beckoned her forward. "Come, Emma. There's something you need to see." She hesitated, but curiosity got the better of her. She stepped into the hallway, the door closing softly behind her. The air was colder out here, and the walls seemed to pulse with an unseen rhythm. The hotel guided her, turning her down unfamiliar corridors and past doors that hadn't existed before. She tried to stop, but her legs kept moving. She wasn't in control anymore. Eventually, she found herself standing in front of another room. The brass numbers gleamed in the dim light. 304. This door was different. It wasn't identical to all the others. The wood was darker, older, and the handle was shaped like a twisted serpent. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and turned the knob. Inside, the room was empty except for a single mirror that stretched from floor to ceiling. The surface was flawless, reflecting her frail form in perfect detail. "Look closer, Emma," the whispers urged. She didn't want to, but her feet carried her forward. When she was just inches from the glass, the reflection changed. It wasn't her anymore. The mirror showed a grand ballroom, filled with people dressed in elegant, old-fashioned attire. They were dancing, laughing, sipping from crystal glasses. But their faces were wrong, blurred and featureless, like they had been erased. And in the center of it all stood the receptionist. He raised his glass to her, smiling that same too-wide grin. "Welcome back," he said, though his lips didn't move. The reflection shifted again. Now it showed the young man she had seen earlier, wandering the halls with panic in his eyes. Behind him, the shadows stretched unnaturally, reaching for him. "No!" Emma shouted, slamming her hands against the glass. "Leave him alone!" But the whispers laughed, the sound echoing through the room. "He's already ours, and so are you." The mirror cracked under her hands, and the world around her dissolved into darkness. When she woke, she was back in room 303. The brass key lay on the desk. The curtains were drawn tightly shut, and outside the door, she heard footsteps, the sound of another guest arriving. Emma sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the door. She knew what was coming. She always did. The cycle never ended.